problem and solution approach. The problem and solution approach is to look at the invention as a solution to an existing problem. There was an existing problem and that problem could not be solved by the person skilled in the art in that particular field, and the problem existed. Either it existed for a long time, or the fact that people were repeatedly trying to prove that problem and to solve that problem and they were unsuccessful. The problem, if it got addressed by an invention, then we would say that the invention solved an existing problem. So, this is called the problem solution approach. There is a problem that existed in the prior art and the documentation in the prior art shows that there is a problem and the invention actually solved that problem. So, the problem solution approach is an important tool in patent drafting, because once you envisage the invention as a solution to a particular problem, then it becomes easier to demonstrate inventive step, because the invention is now presented in the claims as a solution to an existing problem. Now, there are 3 stages in the problem solution approach. The first stage, what are we doing in a problem solution approach? In the problem solution approach, we are trying to determine whether an invention involves an inventive step. So, there is an invention which is disclosed in a patent application, which is filed along with a complete specification. So, we have a claim which discloses an invention. Now, we want to ascertain whether this claim stands clear of an inventive step analysis. So, one of the approach, and this is predominantly followed by the European Patent Office, is the problem solution approach. And in the problem solution approach, the first step would be to determine the closest prior art, because as we mentioned, if we understand the inventive step as a step taken from the prior art, which a person skilled in the art could not take, then it means the step was taken from the closest prior art. So, the closest prior art, there could be multiple prior arts in a particular domain. What was the prior art that was closest to this invention? So, the first step will be in determining the closest prior art. So, if there is a mistake or an error in identifying the closest prior art, then your problem solution approach for determining inventive step will be faulty, because you did not identify the closest prior art. So, the closest prior art will tell you whether the leap from the closest prior art, or to use the step from the closest prior art, was something which was not obvious to a person skilled in the art. So, the first step in the problem solution approach is to determine the closest prior art. Second step is to establish the objective technical problem to be solved. Now, we identify the closest prior art, and the second step is to establish the objective technical problem. Now, these are phrases which have come from the European courts. We may simply phrase it as, what was the technical problem, because the closest prior art would have enumerated the problem, but it would not have solved it. So, first we identify the closest prior art, then we establish the objective technical problem to be solved. So, we define the problem, or we identify the problem to be solved. And the third step is considering whether or not the claimed invention, starting from the closest prior art and the objective technical problem, would have been obvious to a skilled person. That is the obviousness analysis. So, we start from the closest prior art and keep the technical problem in mind and see whether the invention would have been obvious to a person. So, it is still an analysis of whether from the closest prior art, keeping in mind the problem to be solved, a person could have done this. Let us take the example of a paper clip. The paper clip, when it was first invented, it did the job of holding papers together without damaging them. Let us assume that the prior art before the paper clip was a wire which has to be pierced through the document, or it was some kind of a clip which had to bind the document, which could damage the document. So, the paper clip solved the problem of holding papers together without damaging them. Now, the paper clip is quite a simple invention, because it is a steel wire which is bent appropriately in places to hold paper in between the wire. Now, what would be the closest prior art for a paper clip? The closest prior art could be a clip, the closest prior art could be a steel wire, it could be a thread, it could be punching machine, and which could punch holes onto the document and tie it up. It could be, so of the list of prior arts that are there, the first step will be to determine the closest prior art. Let us assume it is a steel wire which can be pierced through the document and tied together. Let us assume, for the sake of understanding this better. Now, once we identify a steel wire or a bit of a wire as prior art, closest prior art, and by this we understand that it is either disclosed, it is manufactured, or it is disclosed in some document. Now, we understand what is the technical problem that had to be solved, objective technical problem to be solved. The objective technical problem to be solved is managing paper or grouping paper together without damaging them. So, to holding paper together, if you stick the paper together, when you remove them apart, it damages them. If you stitch them together, it damages them. If you put a hole and tie it up with a string or with a thread, it again damages them. So, if we understand the issue of the problem to be solved by the paper clip as holding paper together without damaging them, then we will say that the technical problem or the objective technical problem to be solved is to manage papers together without damaging them. Now, we have the closest prior art, which is a steel wire, and we have the problem of managing paper together without damaging them. Now, with these two things, will it be obvious to a person to come up with a paper clip? Now, if the answer is yes, it would be obvious, then paper clip would not solve or would not involve an inventive step, and it would not be granted a patent. But history tells us that there are multiple patents over paper clips over a period of time, especially from the US Patent Office, and history also tells us that paper clip was a hugely successful product which had multiple patents on over a long period of time. So, the problem the first paper clip solved was managing paper without damaging them, and if you look at the prior art, which was just a steel wire, it would have been difficult for a person at that point to envisage a steel wire in such a way that it could be used to hold paper without damaging them. So, this was the problem that was solved by the paper clip. So, the starting point of the closest prior art, we will assume that it is a steel wire, it is a plain steel wire, and the objective technical problem, which we will assume that managing paper, holding paper together without damaging them in any way, so that you could remove the papers and use them as they were in its original condition. If a person who knew the closest prior art and the technical problem could have solved it by coming up with a paper clip, by bending a steel wire in particular places to hold the paper, if the analysis would allow that to happen, then we would say that the invention would not involve an inventive step. If on the other hand, if it can be ascertained that it would not have been obvious to a person who had a steel wire and papers to manage and this problem of damaging paper, then the invention would be non-obvious, or the invention would involve an inventive step. Now, one of the things that affects an inventive step analysis is hindsight. Now, hindsight is can be demonstrated well in the case of a paper clip. Now, if you reverse engineer a paper clip, you get a steel wire. If you unbend it, you get a steel wire. So, it could be possible for people to assume that in hindsight that this is obvious, because it was just a simple piece of wire that was bent in few places. So, One of the principles is that when assessing inventive step, it is important to avoid viewing the solution with hindsight, that is an ex post facto analysis. You should not view the invention with hindsight, because in hindsight it would appear that the invention was obvious. So, the problem solution approach helps you to avoid hindsight, and that is a great way in which patents can be drafted, because in drafting, when you use the problem solution approach, you are actually eliminating the possibility of hindsight creeping in. Avoiding hindsight means that obviousness should be analyzed based on the prior art without any knowledge of the invention. So, when you look at the steel wire, you have no knowledge of the paperclip. So, that is a way in which you can eliminate hindsight. And the problem solution approach, because the problem solution approach involves looking at the problem to be solved, it helps you to avoid the hindsight issue.